Arthur Dayne had imagined dying beneath a clear sky. He had thought it might come under 1,000 banners on some red field of reegers, or in a last stand on the steps of the September of Baylor while dragon banners burned. He had not imagined the broken stones of a lonely tower, the wind scouring the dust so hard it seemed to rasp his skin, the smell of crushed sage mixing with blood. He had not imagined the silence after, so absolute it set his teeth on edge. "Lay her down," Eddard Stark said. His voice was wind-blown and frayed. Howland Reed moved with him, a reed-quiet man, and the woman between them was all bones and heat and the bright iron stink that went beyond any battlefield. The bed they settled her on was piled with linens that had once been fine and were all ruined now. A few blue petals clung to her hair, the last of a crown. "Lyanna," Ned whispered, and at the sound of her name the babe in his arms gave a protesting cry, small as a mouse. Arthur had taken that child from a pallet of torn sheets and passed him to Ned Stark because his hands would not stop shaking. He flexed his fingers now. They were steadier, but the tremor had moved inward, into his chest, his bones, a deep cold. The woman on the bed looked at him. It was a long look for someone so near the end. He wondered if she saw his face or only the white light that people talked about. He had knelt to press the sweat from her brow with a damp cloth, and she had caught his wrist then with surprising strength. "You were his friend," she had said. "You'll keep him. You swore." Arthur remembered glancing towards the door where the remnants of the Kingsguard lay cooling, their honor as brittle as the air. He had not come to this tower to die, though he had been prepared to. He had come to keep the oath he gave to Rhaegar Targaryen the day the prince placed a hand on Arthur's shoulder and said, "You know where my heart lies." "I will keep him," Arthur had told Lyanna Stark in that stark room of stone and blue petals. He had meant it then and meant it now, with her breath coming in ragged pearls, leaving long empty spaces between. To promise one dying woman and one dead man. Such vows a man might break by living, unless he set his life to the work. "Arthur," Ned said. He did not add Ser, and Arthur noted that with a distant corner of himself. Titles had lost their sharp edges here. "He will hunt the child. You know he will. Robert hunts anything with a dragon on it," Arthur said. His mouth felt dry, as if the wind had abraded even his tongue. "How many Kingsguard stand still?" Ned asked. "How many will keep a secret over a crown?" "Enough," Arthur said, though he did not believe it. "Enough if I am one of them." Lyanna's hand found Ned's. She would not let him go. "Promise me," she breathed. The words were cracked reeds. She had said it before Rhaegar died at the Trident and after, and now again when the room had narrowed to a bed and a child and a terrible choice. "I promise," Ned told her. He bent his head. When he looked up, his eyes were wet and exhausted and angry. "But not to you alone." Arthur understood. The wind sighed through every gap in the stones. "Your honor," Ned said tightly. "Will kill him as surely as Robert would." Arthur flinched. There was a time words like that would have called steel. Not now. He looked down at his hands again. They did not look like a murderer's hands. Then he lifted his gaze to the blade that had been an extension of his arm since boyhood. Dawn lay across a trestle, pale as winter's morning, still crusted with the remnants of men. He had seen it cut through mail like cloth that day. He had seen it bite into a Hightower's throat and a Went's ribs and heard the hollow echo that lives in the last breath. He had been the sword of the morning because he had been worthy. The Daynes were not fool enough to trust Dawn to a man unworthy. "I am not asking you to break," Ned said. "I am asking you to bend. Let the realm believe you died with your brothers. Give me the sword, and I will take it back to your sister's keep. It is where it belongs if you are dead." "Swords aren't bones to be buried," Arthur said. And then for the first time since dawn he laughed, low and bitter, because perhaps this one was. "Arthur," Ned said again. Howland Reed had drawn back into the shadows with the child, whose small mouth worked at the air. The thought came unbidden that he had seen Rhaegar's mouth make that same shape when he plucked at his harp, the sound like moonlight on water. Arthur lifted Dawn. The weight was familiar, so familiar that every scar on his hand rose at the touch of the grip. He wiped the blade clean with the care he had given it since squirehood, then turned it, letting the milk-glass sheen catch in the tower's thin light. He remembered cradling Ashara's hands around it once, laughing, as she pressed her cheek to the flat of the blade and said she could see storms in it. He remembered placing it at Rhaegar's feet the night they drank, and he swore his vow anew. He went to Ned and put the sword into the Northern Lord's hands. Ned Stark accepted it like a man shouldering a final weight. His face changed. He looked older by a decade. "I will take it," he said. "I will tell the world you died here with honor. I will tell them anything I must. But you will take the boy." "How?" Arthur asked. "As what?" "As a man who has kept a promise," Ned replied. "Call him sand. Call him snow. Call him nothing at all. Only keep his name off the lips of men who would sell it to a king." "How will I live?" Arthur asked. That was the question that had crept up and bitten his heel when the red mists of battle cleared. He had spent his life pointing toward a prince and a purpose. Without one. "You will live because you are not done," Howland Reed said from the shadows, and Arthur turned to find the crannogman watching him with a steady gaze like water over peat. "You will live because the marsh between the reeds holds secrets. Because a green dream came to me long ago of a pale sword cut not from steel but fallen star, and the man who carried it did not fall that day." Arthur let out a breath he had not known he held. He wanted to tell Reed that he had no patience for bog witchery and frog singing. But the dead were thick in the tower, and their silence had the heavy feel of portent. Lyanna Stark's breath hitched and failed. Ned made a sound like a tree splitting under snow. Arthur crossed himself in the old Dornish way that Ashara had teased him for being too pious to do. They wrapped her in clean linen, and the last blue petals caught beneath the fold, and Arthur thought that was fitting. He held the babe once more. The child's eyes were closed and his mouth a pink bow as he sought warmth. He smelled of blood and milk. Arthur drew a finger down the soft rise of his cheek. "Where will you go?" Ned asked. "Home is closed to me if I'm dead," Arthur said. "But Dorne is wide, and the Greenblood has always been a river hospitable to ghosts." "Willa," Ned said, "you had a wet nurse at Starfall. She belongs to the castle, not to me," Arthur said too quickly. The last thing he could risk was to bring his death to his sister's White Tower. "But there are women on the Greenblood who nurse half the realm." The Mother Royne carried legends along her banks before the Undulls thought to name their swords. "She will carry one more." Ned's mouth quirked. Not humor. Respect that had been scuffed and stitched back over a dozen wounds. "Then go. The world will know you are dead by the time you reach the river, if I have a fast horse and good fortune. Meet me in 10 years in the neck, if the gods are so kind, and we will share a skin of sour Dornish and curse the choices of young princes." 10 years, Arthur said. He did not believe in tender hopes. He tucked the child close to his chest. "If the world is not rebuilt by then, we will set another stone." He took no cloak. He took no badge of the Kingsguard. He left Dawn to the man who had earned it by taking on a lie he had not made, and when he went down the stairs, the stones seemed to lean inward, like ribs closing. He did not look back at the broken tower. He told himself that if he did, he would turn to salt, a pillar fixed forever to a place where all hope had burned away. He walked south, away from the mountains. He walked until the sound of wind on stone became the whisper of water through reeds, and the air grew soft with green-growing smells and the press of heat that ran up off the sands. He sold his horse cheap at an inn and took the next that came for less, and thought no more than necessary about what hands had led it there before. In a village where the walls were made of old ships and desert wind wove through the portholes, he traded the last of his silver for a place on a broad-bottomed boat and drifted down into the maze of green channels and pale willows. On the Greenblood, the riverfolk called him Arlen, because men on boats liked the way names ended in soft sounds, and because there were 1,000 Arlens on 1,000 creaking decks, and any one of them could be a ghost. He cut his hair with a blunt knife so it fell ragged, and let the river sun darken his skin until he would pass for any fisherman's brother. He grew a short beard and trimmed it short again and learned the slow rhyme of the water. The orphans of the green blood were not orphans, not really, or not all of them. They were men and women who swore they had no lord but the river and the prince who sat in a palace by the sea. They were men who had turned their backs on dry land and its laws, and women who had fled their husbands and children, who would never learn a house cry because they had never had a house. They sang songs in a language that sounded like rain on leaves, and when Arthur first came among them he did not understand, and then he did, because grief is a language too, and exile. The babe was hungry and angry, and Arlen took in, or as any man would, and rode until his back ached and his palms went glossy and slick and tough. He kept his eyes down and his shoulders loose. He learned the names of the willows and how to tell, by the set of the river fowl's wings, if a storm would come at sunset. He learned to knot nets that did not catch on lilies. He learned the difference between lily pads with frogs and lily pads with snakes. When the babe would not be soothed by any rocking of the boat or slap of water. When his wails rose to a pitch capable of peeling paint. A woman with silver hoops in both ears and a scar across her upper lip took him into her brown arms and laughed. "He will be a prince," she said, "even if it's only of the fish," and she gave him her breast. The orphans called her Mother Nara for the way she fussed over the river children, and she and Arlen traded the boy between them on long days. He was pudgy for a time, and then frog, and then greedy when he began to crawl from one breast to the next, and then, privately when the night was still, he became John again because Arthur could not bear to let that slip. The name fit his mouth better than Arlen. Mother Nara asked no questions about fathers. She had a habit of humming when she rinsed the cloths in the river, little tunes that came from nowhere. She told stories in the old Roiner cadence when the nights went thick with insects and the children whined. There was a tale about a hero whose sword was the morning star, and the way she said it made the hair on Arthur's arms lift. "You have a look," she said once, squinting at him through the steam of a pot, "like a man who has put down a burden and forgotten where he put it." "I know where I put it," Arthur said. "Ah," Mother Nara said, "then you want to forget you know." When John took his first steps, it was on the deck of the wide boat with its patched painted boards. His hands lifted as if to catch the lee. GHT. He had Rieger's eyes, Arthur had to admit it, the deep summer violet that could turn to storm color when shadow crossed them. In some lights he was pure stark, though, a long solemn northern face opening like winter to the rarest smile. He had lion's mouth, and time did to Arthur what no sword ever had. It found the cracks in him and widened them until he thought he would fall apart for the sake of a mouth and a glance and a laugh. He showed the boy how to hold a wooden sword long before he should have, first as a toy, then as a thing with weight. He showed him how to fall without breaking his wrist and how to stand with his feet like the corners of a square, knees soft. He showed him where to put his thumb on a blade's handle so the force of a strike flowed down into the wrist and out again, not up into the shoulder like a fool. He could not help it. Whatever else he was a knight, and one cannot teach a river child to swim without also teaching him the tides. At 5, John could balance along the narrow gunwale while the river sighed and nudged and the reeds hissed. At 6, he could run from stern to bow and back without knocking over any cooking pots, earning whoops and a pinch on the ear from Mother Nara all the same. At 7, he could set snares beside the quiet backwaters and come back with eels fat as his forearm. "Faster than fish," he would tell Arthur, face all glow, and Arthur would pull him under an arm and breathe in his river sweat and know that even exiles bear gifts. Men came to the green blood sometimes who wore hard leather and soft steel and the narrow-eyed look of a hound that catches scent. They had papers full of seals and names that meant little among the boats. "We ask only a question," one said, a few years after the winds had turned cool and hard for a season and the fish had gone deep. He had the yellow lion of Lannister sewn in poor cloth to his coat, and he pulled at his lower lip with 2 fingers when he spoke, as if the words stuck there. "What princes drown in rivers," Mother Nara said, "and what princes never dipped their toes in one? Here there are only children. Fetch a fish if you like. It will tell you more truth than our mouths." Arthur kept his head down and his jaw loose. He was not the only man on the boat who did so. There were tales of justice and men who kept tally, of kinslayers who smiled with clean hands. It was the Red Mountains that saved them more than the river. Men who were not of the sand bled more quickly in the heat. The Lion Man left with a bundle of dry reeds and the knowledge that he had bought them with good silver and been cheated of any true purchase. Oberyn Martell found them in the spring when the river went green gold and the banks flowered with small, pale blossoms that smelled faintly of pears. The Prince of Dorne came in a little skiff rowed by a boy and with one woman lounging at the prow and two men who could have been anything, and the orphans looked up and smiled without surprise. Princes came and drank their wine and complimented their children, and then went away with the same smile, if they were wise. Arthur knew him at once because Oberyn wore kingship like a snake wears sunlight. "We'll share a jug," Oberyn said, folding himself onto the deck in a spill of silk. His eyes fell on Jon and then moved away, as if unwilling to line up the geometry too quickly. "Well," he said to Arthur, "the river does raise them well, doesn't it? All these narrow wrists and clever fingers. It makes them tough," Mother Nara said. She threw the boy a look that said smaller things. "Be quiet. Be clever." He bobbed his head and drew back by the cook fire, where he might hear every word without appearing to hear any. "You knew Ashera," Oberyn said. Arthur's throat closed. It had been years since he had said her name aloud, though it had lived inside him every day. "I did." He had been a squire with dust in his hair the first time Ashera Dayne courted the sun on the high terrace and teased him for the turn of his ankle. She had a laugh like glass chimes. She had a temper that could flatten a room and a kindness that could open one. "They talk about her as if she were a story," Oberyn said, watching him over the rim of his cup. "I do not correct them because it is more cruel to tell certain truths. The world did not deserve her." Arthur sipped the wine. It was strong and sweet. It did nothing to steady his heart. "No," he said. Oberyn's gaze flicked to Jon again. The boy had a way of folding himself into the air that Ashera had had too, a kind of watchful stillness, as if a day were a thing you could waste or spend on purpose, and he meant to spend as much as he could coin. "Ilaria says I should pick my battles," the prince said lightly. "She says I train too hard for fights I could avoid. Sometimes she is right. Other times, the fight finds you when you are asleep." Arthur did not take the bait. He waited. "The Queen in King's Landing is of House Lannister now," Oberyn said. "Her children are Lannisters by mouth if not by law. My sister's children were murdered by Lannisters. Robert Baratheon puts down dragons because the taste of their blood makes his ale sweeter. The river keeps its oaths. I wonder how many men do." "You are not the law," Arthur said, because he had to say something and because silence would betray as surely as confession. "You would be justice, but justice rarely has a seat at court." "I am Dorne," Oberyn said simply, "and Dorne remembers." He set down his cup. The woman beside him, Ilaria Sand, laid long fingers across his wrist. He turned his hand, curved his own around hers, and the river light went soft on both. "Tell me only whether the boy is safe, Arlen. I will not ask you to put down your burden and name it. Tell me only if you need a prince's boat." "We need a river," Arthur said. Oberyn inclined his head, an acknowledgement cloaked as courtesy. "Some of us are the river that runs at night," he said. "Consider that when you tie your next knot." He left with laughter and a last look at Jon that said too much and nothing at all. After, Arthur lay awake on the deck and watched the stars crawl across the black and felt something lift in his chest like a bird he had kept under a basket and forgotten the shape of sunlight. He had shown dawn to so few men in his life. He had not shown it to Oberyn now. The memory of the sword lay in him, though bright and cold, a promise to a dead prince and a living boy. Years moved like boats, sometimes with the steady pull of water, sometimes spun by eddies, sometimes caught against a root or a rock with a suddenness that bruised the bones. Jon grew lean and lengthened, the angles of his body announcing the man he would be a heartbeat before he became it. He had hands that were quick to help and slow to harm, except when Arthur put a blade in them. Then he was quick all around. He learned to read from a weather-stained septon who had taken to river life after too much wine in a dry place. And he learned accounts from Mother Nara and the way a shoal will hide itself under a ripple from the river itself. He learned the names of the constellations slowly, because the stars were the same over Dorne as they were over Winterfell, and it did not seem fair that some things refused to shift even when a man lost everything else. Once, when Jon was 10, a band of Sellswords pushed up the green blood under the Lion's same badge, only better stitched. They had proper armor and cocky grins and a sheet of charges with half the vowels mangled. They wanted boys with dark hair and girls with golden skin and men who might have swung a pale sword once upon a time. Arthur had made up his mind to slip off the boat long before they came into shouting range. He had made up his mind not to draw steel unless he had to. He had made up his mind to be water. One of the Sellswords, a man with half an ear and the circling cunning of the beaten, laid hands on Jon's shoulder. It was casual, the way men lay claim in places they think their coin buys law. Jon stood very still. He looked up out of those winter eyes, and Arthur saw himself when he was a boy, lifting his chin and swallowing anger like a blade without a scabbard. Arthur's hand went to the knife at his belt. He did not carry a sword on the river. He did not trust himself not to become it the moment he felt the weight. It was a small mercy that the knife was sharp and the Sellsword's grip was sloppy. Arthur cut across the tendons of the man's thumb in a neat arcing stroke and pushed Jon behind him with his free hand. "Ah," the Sellsword said, more surprised than hurt, and then he tried to be the man he had bragged he was, and the fight turned hot. There was a beauty to the dance that Arthur had never lost. Step and turn, wrist and shoulder, the way the world reduced to the space between one breath and the next, the line of a blade in motion. There was nothing beautiful about a fight on a narrow deck with children clinging to a mast and a pot of fish stew scalding the feet of men in mailed boots. But Arthur had learned to take beauty where he could. He slipped into it without shame. Two men went over the side with long white faces to the clapping applause of the river. One lay cracking the boards with the back of his skull and staring up at the sky with a new sort of sincerity. Another threw down his sword and dove without removing his helm. That was perhaps the smartest thing he did in his life. When it was done, the man with half an ear stood panting and bleeding and glaring, and Arthur offered him a hand with the same courtesy he would have given a knight on some tourney field a lifetime ago. "This is Dorne," Arthur said. "You may take what you pay for, and what we sell we set the price of. If you want river children, buy dolls." "We will come back," the man snarled. "Then bring better men," Arthur said. They did not come back. Word ran up the green blood faster than any skiff and over the hills to Sunspear and down into the alleys to the men who listened there. 2 weeks later, a bucket of oranges arrived at Mother Nara's boat from no one, and a ribbon for Jon's hair that he pretended to hate and wore for 3 days because Mother Nara said it made him look like a prince of cleverness. Arthur ate an orange at dusk. Tasted like sun. When Jon was 12, it rained thundered in the mountains for days, and the river rose so fast it tore loose things no one had remembered were anchored. Arthur woke one night to the sound of wood screaming and grabbed Jon with one hand and the mast with the other as their home lifted and struck and lifted again. "Let go!" Mother Nara screamed at them all. "Let go and let the river decide." And Arthur thought then that every vow he had ever made was a matter of when to hold and when to let go. In the morning, when the water had subsided enough that the reeds showed bruised tops and the banks glittered with the flotsam of 100 lives, Arthur walked with Jon, picking along the mud. They found a box with iron corners and a dead monkey and a bundle of linen with a child in it who started breathing again when Mother Nara turned him upside down and thumped his back. "We will call him Moss," she said, because he was green around the edges. And later she handed him to a woman who had lost a child, and that was how things went on the river. You took and gave back and tried to end with hands as empty as when you began. On a dry bank where the sun had baked the mud hard enough to crack, Arthur and Jon found a small thing that caught the light. Jon crouched, elbows on knees, neat as a scribe, and lifted it carefully. It was a pendant, a trinket of pale stone carved like a rose, its petals so fine they might have broken if you breathed too hard. A winter rose, the kind that bloomed blue as sky and snow. "This was my mother's," Jon said without knowing. Arthur felt the whirl. De-tilt. He could lie. He had told himself he would lie as long as he had to, for as long as the boy needed. But the sight of those petals, he could not put his tongue to ash. "It might have been," he said, and that was the most truth he could wrap around the lie. "Keep it safe." Who was she? Jon asked. A woman of the north, Arthur said. Wild and brave. She laughed at the wrong jokes. She could ride like a windstorm and argue like a lawyer. She showed me there were more colors than I had in my head. And my father? A prince, Arthur said. A man who wanted to fix things with songs. A man who named the stars even when they did not answer back. Jon held the pendant in his palm. It made a pale disc the shape of a coin, like a promise. He put the cord around his neck and tucked the rose under his shirt as if afraid the river would steal it. And in the weeks after, he would draw it out sometimes and look, not always when he thought Arlen was watching. Sometimes he would hold it and talk, and Arthur would hear the murmurs like the conversation a man has with himself at the edge of sleep. Time built a scaffolding around Arthur's choice. Each year added a beam, a brace. By the time Jon could best Arlen know Arthur, in a footrace from the stern to the bow and back, the scaffolding had the weight of a castle. There were days when Arthur thought he might have built one if he had only had stones. He had wood instead, and ropes and water and a single boy and his oaths. He found it was enough. He learned things along the river that he had not learned at court. He learned to mend without leaving a scar. He learned to listen to women and to children even when they spoke in circles. He learned to tell when a man was going to try to kill him by the way the man held his shoulders an inch tighter and his mouth a degree flatter before he moved. He learned not to kill men when he did not have to. He learned the look a boy gives you when he is measuring you for his future, and he learned to live inside it without choking. He never stopped waking at night with his hand out toward a sword that was not there. News came to the river late and odd and slanted. It came tied to the tongues of merchants and the boots of couriers and the skirts of whores who had heard it from lords with their hair down. It came as rumor and as riddle. It came the year Jon turned 16 in the form of a barefoot boy who had run through 3 villages and a handful of orchards to find Mother Nara's boat. He had a grin split wide across his face and wide eyes that made the grin look terrible. They took his head, he gasped. The king took the hand's head and stuck it on a spike for crows. Arthur was on his feet without knowing he had moved. The deck tilted. River light flickered and went knives. Whose? He said, and his voice was not his own. He saw Ned Stark with his hair wet and his mouth set, asking for what no man should have to. He saw Lyanna on a bed of blue petals with her hands closed around an oath. Whose head? Lord Stark, the boy said, as if tasting the words. The king's hand. The wolf. They chopped it off in front of the whole city. Jon stood as if he had been cut cleanly along the length of his bones and might slide apart. His face went white and then red and then white again. Arthur could not read the first thing in it. His own insides burned. He had braced for this moment, for news that would run a blade under all the neat knots he had tied. He had thought he could meet it like a knight. He had thought poorly. Mother Nara sat down. She made a small sound. She had nothing to do with this man far away, this lord. She knew only that the world had broken somewhere, and the river would carry the echoes down. Because of the king's son, the boy said, eager to show he had collected more than one coin. Because of the prince, for striking the prince. And because of the Lion Queen. He shook his head as if to rattle the story into sense. Arthur made himself draw breath. He had not wept when he died, and he would not weep now. Where? He asked. How? In the city, the boy said, impatient now because the grief of grown men is dull compared to the sound of his own voice. Near the September. They were counting the crows and the heads and the women and the... That's enough, Mother Nara said. Her voice had iron in it that Arthur had not heard before. Eat, boy, she told the messenger, and keep your mouth busy with fish for a bit. Save your words for other boats. When he had gone, and the river had resumed its breath, Jon spoke for the first time since the news had hit them like a hammer. He was my... He could not find a word that fit. The river gave you a vocabulary, but some days it had holes in it. He was the best man I ever met, Arthur said. The words might have burned him if he had not said them. He was a quiet man who lived louder than most. He never put a hand on a woman in anger and never looked away when a wall needed mending. He took my sword and carried my death, and he did not make me feel small for not hating him for it." Jon's eyes came up, wild. "Then why did you let him die?" The question struck exactly where it should. Arthur took it the way he would take a practice blow. He let it move through him instead of bracing against it so hard his bones cracked. "I did not let him," he said. "There was no letting in this. Men with crowns decide and men with swords end, and men like your Ned try to make the space between as big as they can, and sometimes it is not big enough." Jon's mouth worked. The wind collected behind him and made the ends of his hair lift like seagrass. "He died," Jon managed. "He died because of kings and princes and all the things we pretend are stories on the river. He died because men put on crowns and forgot they were men. He died because he was honest in the wrong city," Arthur said softly. "He died because he set his hand to a wheel that had been spinning too long, and the men who had attached themselves to it would rather be broken than let it slow. He died because he was brave and he misjudged. He died because it was raining and because he had not eaten and because he thought at the wrong moment about the wrong person's child. He died because some days it does not matter how good a man is. He still died a good man." Jon swallowed. Took him 2 tries. "I want to see snow," he said suddenly. Arthur blinked. The river noise sharpened and then fell back. Jon's hand was fisted around the pale stone rose so tightly the edges must be cutting into his palm. "It will chill your bones," Arthur said automatically. "It will get into your boots and make your toes ache." "I don't care," Jon said. "I want to see where he came from. I want to see a wall of ice and know that I can stand under it and feel small and stop feeling like I could kill the whole world with my hands and it would not be enough." Silence sat heavy a moment. Mother Nara watched them without pretending not to. She turned a spoon in a pot and made circles of steam. "The north swallows men," she said, because it was a thing a mother must say when boys look farther than the horizon. "The river would grieve you." "You taught me to swim," Jon said. He had never in his life spoken in a way that could wound her. It was not wounding to say this, and yet it was. He had always known how to make a statement that carried more than the words it wore. Arthur let out a breath that turned to a laugh before he caught it. Rhaegar had looked at the north once and seen a poem. Lyanna had looked at the south and seen a prison. Arthur looked at this boy and saw a border that had to be crossed. "We'll go," he said. The words felt like a sword drawn at last from its scabbard after a long winter of rust. He had dreaded the day this decision came, because moving north meant moving toward his name. He had thought to spare Jon that. He had thought to make of him a riverman who could marry and raise fish and children and make more baskets than resolve. It had always been a lie. He had been raising a sword. They left the boat the next week. Arthur gave Mother Nara half of everything he had, which was too much by her count and not enough by his. She put her palm to his cheek and said nothing else because there was nothing else to say. Jon embraced her carefully, as if too tight a grip would break his own ribs. Moss, who had grown into a boy with a gap-toothed grin and a knack for falling out of boats and not drowning, cried until he hiccuped and then pinched Jon's leg so hard he yelled, and then they were even. They went on foot because horses made a noise that traveled farther than a man's breathing, and because Arthur trusted his legs more than any beast. They cut through the stony skirts of the Red Mountains by night and lay up during the day, learning the way shadow pooled behind rocks and how the wind tasted just before it shifted its mind. They went down into the Stormlands, stepping carefully around thunder, and up through the Crownlands by paths no one who lived there would have called paths. There were soldiers everywhere, folding and unfolding like an ugly dance, flags going up and flags going down, lies darting like minnows under the surface of pond water. Arthur kept his head bowed and his hands away from his belt when men who owned the road wanted to talk. Jon learned to smile a little and talk about fish. It got them farther than Arthur's silence would have. They joined a caravan for a time, working in exchange for food as any man might. Jon drove oxen and grew blisters he wore with a pride that made Arthur want to scold, and instead made him laugh the way Ashera had laughed when he had come back from his first long ride with a saddle sore so bad he had limped for 2 days. In the Riverlands they met men with leaf badges who called themselves the Brotherhood without banners, with a straight face and a crooked smile. The world was filling with brotherhoods and banners. These men had one and not the other most days, but they had a priest whose eyes were tired and gentle, and when he prayed the air around his words warmed a little as if a fire had just been banked. There was a lord among them who looked like a ghost wearing a man's skin. He had the courtesy of a lord still, and the manners of a man who has died and been sent back to sit at a feast and be grateful for dry bread. "Your face is familiar," the ghost lord said to Arthur. "Did I ever owe you money?" "Not unless you borrowed in Dorne," Arthur said. "Ah," the lord replied. "Then I owe you a debt for son that I have never seen." His smile flickered. He had a scar on his neck, half-healed and livid. "And you, boy? What do you owe the world?" John looked at him as if the question were not rhetorical. He had a way of taking words into his hands and turning them until they showed their cracks and new edges. "A sword, I think," he said after a moment, "and the work that comes with one." The lord laughed and then coughed, a dry rasp, and the priest put a steadying hand against his back without thinking. "The way you set a bowl in a safer place when a breeze picks up. You have the look of it," he said. "If you are going north, take the causeway and ask the marsh men for Brylan's ford. Tell them the fox with one ear sends you. They'll lie and pretend they don't care, but they do." "Why help us?" Arthur asked. He did not trust men who offered gifts without asking for a price. He had learned in courts that everything had a price, and on the river that the price was not always coin. The ghost lord lifted one shoulder. The priest answered instead. "Because I dreamed of a pale blade in winter," he said. "Because the dead are too many these days and sometimes they stay. Because someone has to stop the wheel somewhere." They found the causeway through the neck as if they had known it since boyhood. It was boards over bog and loose logs pools and occasionally a crust of earth that gave under the foot like an old memory. Men came out of the reeds without ripple, eyes dark, faces painted with mud. They were small as reeds and strong as roots. "Brylan," a woman said when John gave the name. "And who sends you?" Her spear was as casual in her hand as a spoon. "The fox with one ear," John said, because he could not lie convincingly and because a true name was a key to some doors. The woman's mouth quirked. She took them in. The Crannogmen fed them a fish stew that tasted of watercress and old magic. They listened while Arthur said almost nothing and John said a little more, about seeing snow and standing under a wall of ice and hearing a sound he had heard only in his sleep. A man with hair the color of lichen and hands large as paddles came to sit across from them. He could have been anything, and Arthur knew in the way his hair lifted that he was something important. He had never in his life forgotten a face he had fought with or against. He did not forget this one. "Howland Reed," Arthur said. The Crannogmen studied him from under his lashes. He had that same water stillness, that patience. "I had thought perhaps you would be the one to break our oath first," he said without malice. "I see the river taught you otherwise." "I grew tired of oaths breaking things," Arthur said. The man's mouth went, for an instant, like a shoreline smoothed by a wave. "You kept one," he said almost gently, "that I did not think could be kept, and let another man carry the weight of your death so long his hair must have gray in it by now." He cocked his head. "And this is the boy." John sat straighter. "John," he said. He set his hand on the pale rose that lay against his shirt. Howland Reed looked and looked and looked, until Arthur wanted to stand up and step in front of the boy and wanted as much to force the world to see him. "You have your mother's mouth," the Crannogman murmured, "and your father's stubbornness." He touched his own chest, just above his heart, as if something there hurt him. "You were born in blood," he said, "but not all debts are red." He told them more than Arthur had thought he would. He spoke of a tower and a bed and blue petals and a woman whose laugh had been like a wind bell. He spoke of a prince who had done his best with what he thought the world was made of and had been wrong and had died for it. He spoke of a northern lord who had done his best with what the world actually was and had died for that too. He did not name any of them. He did not have to. "Will you go to him?" Howland asked later, as they walked between short trees silvered with damp. The air smelled of peat and green rot. "To whom?" Arthur asked, though it was a question without honesty. "To the ice," Howland said. To the place where the world bends under weight. Men are making a great noise in the south, as if you could drown out winter by shouting. We will go, Arthur said. We'll keep going as long as our feet carry us. Howland Reed inclined his head. When the water is too cold, he said, light a fire with this. He pressed a wrapped bundle into Arthur's hand. It was much heavier than it looked. Later, when they had gone on and were camped in a scrub of pine beside a pool that reflected stars so perfectly John said it made him dizzy, Arthur unwrapped the bundle. Inside was iron that looked like it had been melted and poured into molds without any Lord's sense of symmetry, and stone that was not stone, slick black and sharp, and a thing that looked like a child's toy but was a knife with a blade that drank light. Obsidian, John whispered, because the septon had been a good teacher and because the word fit the shape in his hand. Dragonglass, Arthur said, for killing stories. He slept with the knife near him after that, though he did not know why the sight of it made his fingers ache. They came at last to a place where the sky got large and thin and the air took the softness out of the lungs. They came to a city of ice that held back emptiness. The wall rose in its patient cold and did not care who stood before it. It made Arthur feel exactly as John had said he wanted to feel, small and honest and not the center of anything. It made him want to lay down any blade he had ever carried and let the cold pick his bones. They passed under that great blue weight at Eastwatch, for it was the closest, and took passage along the top in a creaking barrow pulled by men who had the shoulders for it, and Arthur thought he had rowed boats his whole life and had never known how to be grateful for flat water. The night beyond the wall gathered like a held breath. Birds did not fly there. Sound did not carry there the same way. John's eyes were bright and his cheeks burned, and he would not stop smiling even when he could not feel his fingers. It made him look 77. At Castle Black there were men in black with eyes like holes from which someone had dug hope. There was a Lord Commander with a voice like a gravel road who looked at Arthur's hands and did not ask names. There was a maester older than stone, with eyes like summer sky you might drown in. You are welcome, the old man said, and he wrapped John's cold fingers in his and warmed them with the gentleness of a man who had learned patience when it mattered and never set it down again. This is as far north as the world goes. John said, Is it? Under his breath, and Arthur heard and pretended to ignore it. They put their names into a ledger and Arthur wrote Arlen of the Green, and the stooped boy with the quill smiled because he had known 3 Arlens last week and another 2 this morning. And then he did not smile because Arthur set his hand on the page and said, Snow, and scribbled the letters he had not written in 16 years. It satisfied something petty and important in him to write it, as if he had built a small bridge. Snow, John said, and the sound of it made him flush with something that was none of Arthur's business. He put his name down as John Snow, and Arthur thought of sand and river and men and vows, and he thought of Ned Stark's face when he had made himself smaller to hold a life larger than his own, and he thought, let this be a shield. Let it be enough. The wall teaches faster than the river. It has fewer gentle men and slower questions. It has white that blinds and cold that steals speech. John learned to swing a pick into ice and not lose his fingers to the recoil. He learned to wrap his cloak so that wind could find no purchase on his back. He learned to set his feet on hard snow the way he had learned on a boat to distribute his weight, and he learned to move in a drift the way he had moved through reeds. He learned that men who had chosen black had not always had a choice. Arthur taught as he always had, with his hands and his feet and his patience. He took a long stick and put it in John's hand and said, This is a sword, and he knocked it out of the boy's grasp until John stopped trying to hold it and started to become it. He showed him how to turn his hips and sink from the knees, how to watch a man's shoulders and hips because the wrists will lie. He watched other boys too, the soft fat one with the eyes that went to the ground and stayed there, the one with a laugh too loud because laughter was a larger cloak than any black one. He made a thing of training, not a punishment but a craft. He had found his burden again and could carry it. Nights Arthur walked the wall. The cold ate the thoughts from a man's head and left behind the bone of them. He thought of dawn, where it lay somewhere sunning itself. He did not know where it lay. Ned would have taken it to Starfall. Perhaps they had hung it high in the pale stone sword as a memory of a man who did not exist. Perhaps Lady Illyria had sealed it in a chest and laid her cheek against the lid sometimes at dusk. Perhaps Oberyn had gone to look at it and had said something rude and true. On the 6th night, the horn sounded. 1 blast, 2, 3. The old men froze like men who feel their graves crack open. The young ones looked foolish and brave both. Arthur's hand found the knife of black stone, as if it had been living there his whole life. They came out of night like the memory of fear. Arthur had heard stories, and none of the stories were right in their words, and all were right in their teeth. They moved like dancers and like dead things and like ice. They were not men. Arthur had fought men all his life. His body knew men, knew their weight and rhythm. These were not men. They were something the world had held back until now. A wight came first, and it was nothing but a man without warmth. It had eyes like a well with no bottom. It broke the first spear it met and plucked a sword out of a young hand as if the young man had been offering a cup of milk. Arthur did not hesitate. He did not think. He drove the dragonglass knife into the base of the thing's skull and felt a crack like frost shattering on stone. The wight went loose all at once, its limbs nothing but cumbersome sticks now, and Arthur stepped back, chest heaving, the knife in his hand so cold it burned. Jon was there because he always was. He had a torch and he had a stick and he had the look of a man who will only know afterward whether what he did was brave. Arthur shouted for him to keep the fire high and Jon did, making the air ripple with heat that pushed back. The others, when they swam into the guard fire's light, did not look afraid. They did not look at all. They moved with a grace that made Arthur's back ache to watch. He had never seen anyone, not even a Dayne with his best blade, move that way. He had a moment of pure fury that the gods had made beauty so terrible. Another crossed his path. He brought the blade up, an old habit with nothing behind it now because he had no blade to bring. He crossed his obsidian in the air with a shove. The other tilted its head as if amused. It lifted its sword. It was a sword the way ice is a statue, a thing frozen into a shape it barely deigned to inhabit. Arthur spun the way Oberyn had taught him on a day by the river and put his shoulder into the push that passed the other by, and as it went he felt the brush of cold so deep it sang in his teeth. Jon darted in. He was too young and too everything, and he had the torch high. He thrust the flame toward the other, and its sword slid almost casually, and the torch went in two, and there was fire, and there was char, and then there was only one torch, and Jon's eyes were so wide Arthur wanted to slap him for the risk and the grace both. They might have died there if the horn had not sounded again, or if the old men had not found in their bones the right fear, the useful fear that makes you hold and step instead of run. Or if the world had not decided that night that it would allow them one more day. The others slipped into the dark as if brushed backward by a hand. The wights fell where they were, stiff as childhood toys. The cold hung. It watched the living quietly and was disappointed for the moment and left like weather. Arthur's knees shook. He reached for Jon and found him by instinct and gripped the boy's shoulder until the tremor in his own bones stopped echoing. "What was that?" Jon asked, hushed and hungry. "That," Arthur said, "is what Rhaegar sang about when he did not know he was singing about it. There are songs for them?" Jon's voice went fierce. "Then someone else has seen them." "Men have seen many things," Arthur said. He looked up into a sky empty and full. "Men tell about half of them and forget a quarter and lie about the rest." The Lord Commander came down from the wall with his cloak stiff with frost. He had a crow on his shoulder that pecked at the ice in his beard as if to free a crust of bread. "You did well," he told them both, and then, because he was a man who had learned how to make men move by making them believe, he added, "You looked like you knew what you were doing." "We will," Jon said simply. They buried the men who had been men. They burned the ones who were not. The stench drew a wolf out of the woods. It stood at the treeline like a prince of something older than men and watched them until the flames bit less fiercely. His coat was pale as dawn. Jon did not move. The wolf looked at him and looked away, and Arthur let out a breath he had not meant to hold and did not know whether to be grateful or disappointed that the world had not sent a companion for the boy from the trees. It was the old maester who found the words Arthur had not been able to. He had a way of tilting his head that made him seem like a story that had woken up and come to lean against your doorframe, a good story that did not think too much of itself. "You have chosen," he said to Jon the next day. When John put his name in the ledger again, this time beneath the vows, and said the words with a voice that did not break because he would not let it. "You will have to choose again and again. Isn't that what choosing is?" John asked. He had a bruise on his cheek now, a neat dark shape from a crossbar he had not seen in the dark. It made him look less like a prince and more like a man. "Some men choose once," the maester said. "Some men are chosen every day." He looked at Arthur then. He had said little in the hours after the horn blew. Now he said, "And some men burn and burn and burn and never turn to ash. It is a strange world." Arthur bowed a little, honor for honor. "I have burned less than some," he said. "More than others." "Who named him?" the maester asked. It was not a question for the ledger. "His mother," Arthur said. The lie was gentle. He owed the dead their truth and the living their safety. "In her fashion." "Winter roses," the maester murmured. "My brother once picked a handful for a girl when we were boys, and she beat him for killing her flowers. He understood then that even beauty has a root." Arthur found a man in the yard later who had spent his life with sheep and went beyond the wall because there were none left in the shadow of a war and because he wanted to be needed. Arthur set a stick in his hands and turned him just so, and then just so again, and told him to watch men's hips because wrists lie, and in the corner of his eye he saw John talking to the fat boy with the ground eyes, saying very little and listening very much, and thought, "This is the work. This is what a sword is for. Time at the wall is a fist. Closes. It opens. Closes again. It has a rhythm like a heart with a skip to it. Men died in the snow and the world did not mark them. Men were born at Crasters and the world did not mark them either." Arthur had thought he had learned grief. He learned it again in the cold and found it a different shape when it froze. They went on a ranging under a hard white moon, a slice of men against an ocean of trees. The old ranger with the cruel good hands, corn half-hand, rode with them and watched John with the gaze of a butcher considering a lamb that might be a wolf. The wind sawed at them. The snow gave under their boots like baked bread under a knife. They found a village with the roof collapsed under weight and the hearth full of bones. They found an old man frozen in his chair with his hands stretched toward a chest as if the wood would shift under the force of his wanting. In a hollow between 3 hills, they found a cache of obsidian. That was wrong. That was a child's lost toy outside its box. There were pieces carved like arrowheads and pieces you could put into a palm and make a man into a different sort of man. Arthur touched one and felt in it the cold he had felt on the wall when an other's blade passed and did not strike. Not the same cold. A cold with a purpose. "Who puts this here?" he asked. "The first men," the ranger with the good hands said. "Or children, or trees, or stories. No one remembers because there are too few men and too many days. They took enough to make a handful of arrows and kept moving, because you did not stay in hollows forgotten by both sky and fire. It went wrong because things do. The free folk moved like a tide. They came with their own songs and their own fierce, ragged honor, and Arthur did not blame them for wanting south any more than he blamed the ice for wanting the world. There was a girl among them with hair the color of fox fur and a mouth like a cut. She looked at John as if she had found a coin in a prayer box. John looked back as if he had not known the world contained a coin like that. She ran and he ran and they ran in the same direction one day for a time. Arthur saw it happen and put the pain where such things go in a man when he has learned to live around them. Corin made the choice he had to, and Arthur saw the shape of it a breath before he did. He saw the half-hand set his jaw and give John a gift with his knives. He would have stepped in if he could have changed anything, but he could only have made it messy and taken from John something he would always have to have. The boy killed the man who had made a path through winter for other boys. Corin died the way men like him die, with his eyes clear and his mouth sweet with the taste of the last right thing he could do. John stumbled back into camp a different shape. You could press a hand against a child every day and not notice the growth, and then a mark on the doorframe would be higher and you would see the truth. The truth was that some doors were too low now for the boy to go through. He laid down what he had carried of a winter and took up another kind. The war in the south rolled on its belly. Crows brought rumors and men brought lies. The king in the north. Arthur could not bring himself to say the name aloud for a long time. ate and drank and bled and burned, and the river ran red where it coughed up swords and brides and broken men, and then it ran clear again because rivers are like that. Stannis Baratheon came to the wall with iron in his eyes and a woman who smelled of smoke in his shadow, and Arthur watched Jon. The boy listened to all of them, to Stannis and to the old maester and to the men in black who were tired and to wildlings whose speech made new muscles work in the mouth. He listened, and then he spoke as little as a man can when he has to ask a wall to stand, because stones listen to men who do not waste words. There were days Arthur itched under his skin with a need he could not scratch. It was a need made of a blade and a hill and a city and a name. There were days he could feel dawn in his bones, as if the sword were a bone the gods had forgotten to put under his skin. There were nights he dreamed of a room with blue petals and woke with his hands pressed on his chest, as if to keep something from falling out of him. On a winter noon that felt like dawn because the light was thin and tentative, a raven came, and it did not stop for food. It came to Arthur Dayne and pecked his glove until he swore softly between his teeth and held out his wrist. It was a foolish thing to do with a raven. It landed and dug its claws in, and Arthur grunted and did not knock it away because the gods had turned his life into a series of unwise acts with swords and ravens now. There was a sealed thing on its leg with a ribbon white as summer. He cut it free and walked to a place where the wind would carry sound away and broke the seal with the nail of his thumb. The paper smelled faintly of oranges. There were 7 words on it. In a hand he could feel his voice. Bring the dawn back to Starfall. He did not laugh. He closed his hand hard and the parchment crumpled under his fingers finally. After holding princes and deaths and vows and winter, something that could give was satisfying. He found Jon in the yard, talking to the fat boy, who had turned out to be clever in a way that would save more lives than a man's swing. The old maester was beside them, drinking sun from a cup as if it tasted like wine. "Walk," Arthur said. Jon fell in step as he always did, as if their feet had learned each other's measure and would keep it until one of them stopped and the other stumbled. They went up onto the wall because sometimes the only way to talk was to put the world under you. "I need to go south," Arthur said. Jon's head turned sharply. The wind took his breath and made the word, "Why?" sound like a prayer. "To fetch a sword," Arthur said. "I thought I had done with it. I was wrong." Jon's eyes went to his knife, the black one, then back to Arthur's face. "Will you come back?" "If the world lets me," Arthur said. "If you call, boy, I will come in any case, even if the world has other business." Jon gripped the edge of the ice. His knuckles went white under the skin. "Who are you?" Arthur looked at him then, properly, the way he had avoided doing when he had given the boy half-truths and whole names that were not his. He saw the Rhaegar shape there and the lion laugh gone hard and the man who was neither of them and both. "I am the man your father chose to be by your side when he could not." The word father dropped between them and lay breathing like a fish on the ice. "I will tell you his name when you would not use it like a knife." Jon's mouth flattened. "I am not in the habit of cutting men with what they give me." "You are your mother's son," Arthur said. He took the boy's shoulder in his hand for a breath and then let go because men on the wall do not hold each other like that where wind can see. He left that afternoon with a cloak too thin, a purse too light, and a promise too heavy. He took the King's Road when he could and the deer tracks when he couldn't, and he slept in hedges and in the corners of half-burnt hall houses where ghosts did not mind sharing their empty. He did not hurry because hurrying would not bring Starfall closer. He kept a steady pace because that would make each mile bearable. In Dorne, the light cut him. He had not known he had grown used to a world without color until he opened his eyes and the sun put its thumbprints on them. The pale stone sword rose like a memory you had hidden from yourself. He had snuck beneath her shadow as a boy to swim in the cove where the water is as blue as a young girl's dream and the fish come up to kiss your fingers. And now he stood before her with a beard and hard lines where laughter had once been. The guards did not know him. Why should they? The day had come when the world did not recognize his face. "Tell your lady," he said, "that the river has sent a man home." Lady Illyria Dayne had Ashara's eyes and someone else's mouth. She looked at Arthur a long time and then she put both hands on his face and said, not softly, "You bastard." And then, with a break in her voice like a cup dropped against stone, "You noble, stupid, faithful bastard. Only one of those," Arthur said. And because tears are another kind of knife, he put his hand over hers and let his head fall forward until his forehead found her shoulder. They did not make a ceremony of it. Illyria led him into a room that had once been Ashara's and was now any woman's, with jugs and brushes and lace and the same light that had always come in through that window, indifferent to the people it fell on. Dayne lay wrapped in clean white cloths on a table simple as bread. There was no horn. There was no song. Illyria went away and left him with it like a confession. His hands shook when he touched the cloth and shook more when the blade showed itself. He could see himself in it and perhaps 1,000 other men, and he could see the morning as it had come into 1,000 rooms through holes in the wall. Dawn made you honest with yourself. He ran his fingers along the flat of it like a man touching a lover's face after too long, and his knees went weak. He had not known H. He was empty until he was full. Oberyn came that night with oranges and a grin and Illyria and the smell of sand in his cloak. "You took your time," he said. "I had miles," Arthur said. "Do you want men?" Oberyn asked. "If we are cutting throats in alleyways," Arthur said. "Perhaps. If we are standing on a wall of ice, I will take boys who know which end of a bough to put to their shoulder and men who can keep a fire fed." "We have both," Oberyn said simply. "We have Ned Dayne, who insists he is Edric to anyone who will listen and some who will not. We have Darkstar, though gods help any who turn their backs on him. We have girls who can put a needle in an eye from 50 paces and call it justice. We have oranges. We have Doran, who says yes and means wait and says wait and means yes. We have Illyria, who can turn a man with a kiss and a woman with a story." "I need none of it," Arthur said. "I need my sword and my feet." "You need a boat's worth of obsidian," Oberyn said. "Illyria says we have a debt to ice. She has strange ideas, but it is difficult to argue with a woman who looks at you as if you were a new kind of fruit." Arthur looked at Illyria, who tilted her head. "We will send glass sharp as lies," she said. "And some boys who think it is a tale they are joining. You will send them back men." "You put a great deal on my return," Arthur said. "I have always bet on men who hate themselves the right amount," Illyria replied. He had dawn on his back when he walked out of Starfall at dawn. He had a packet of glass and iron in his pack and a little skin of wine he did not need. He had Illyria's smell at his shoulder, a memory of oranges, and the knowledge that the sword had warmed under his touch the way it always had. He did not look back again because men who look backward at towers with faces carved into them fall into the ground and drown in their own footpaths. The world gathered itself while he walked. It does that sometimes, for the sake of single men. A storm moved its attention off the pass when he came to it. A band of louts with spears had already been given the fight they wanted before he arrived. A woman with a basket of apples stepped into a hole in the road he would have stepped into otherwise. At the wall, the cold took a knife to him. He let it. He went under the ice and threw into the courtyard with the sword wrapped and slung, and men stopped what they were doing and looked because sometimes even men who do not know a thing can smell it. John turned in the yard with his cloak flying and his hair full of cold and his mouth open as if to catch snow. And the boy turned the way a man turns when the world puts something in his hands he has been reaching for without knowing. Arthur stopped where he stood and did not take the sword from his shoulder. "Do not fall on your face," he told himself, because the wall had a sense of humor and it would amuse it to let him do just that. He and John climbed to the top of the wall with the sword between them like a secret and the old maester's eyes at their backs like a blessing. At the top, the wind pressed them. Arthur took the wrappings off. Dawn lay across both hands, bright and pale. John had never seen it, and yet he gazed at it with the expression men reserve for things they recognize before they know. "It is not Valyrian," Arthur said. "It is older. Or not. It is different. It will cut a man the same. It might cut something else if that is the way the world is made." John reached out and stopped. "It is beautiful," he said, because he was a boy still where beauty could be spoken. "It is heavy," Arthur said, because he was a man and knew that weight was what mattered. "Will it help?" John asked. He did not mean with men. Arthur set the flat of the blade against the ice of the wall. He listened. The sword did not sing. It did not make a pretty sound, but the ice changed around it, minutely, the way skin will gooseflesh around a fingertip. "I think so," he said. "I think it is a kind of mourning." The horn sounded that night because the world gives you the test just after you sharpen your tools. Arthur and John stood on the ring wall with men who had eaten too little and slept too little and had more stubbornness than sense, and they looked out at a tide of bodies. A giant walked among them like a thought you could not keep down. Whites crawled over one another, and among them, occasionally, in a space where the cold went calm, another walked. Arthur drew dawn. He could feel every mark in the grip and every scratch that his own hand had put in the leather with years of sweat. He stepped down into the gate and John beside him, and that was where Ygritte's arrow came out of the dark and stuck in the wood to Arthur's right, and where her laugh came like a challenge. And he thought then that you cannot save boys from the things you could not save yourself from, and that perhaps you should not. It was messy because fights are. There were moments that would be a song if someone wanted them to be, but mostly there was mud in a man's mouth and a crack where a bone went wrong and the smell of blood steaming a little in the cold like soup. The giant pushed at the gate and men pushed back, and Arthur did not herniate every muscle in his back by will alone, though it felt like it afterward. An other came into the shadow of the gate, slow and without hurry. Dawn met its blade and the sound was like glass biting ice. Arthur's arm jarred to the elbow. He pushed. John ducked under and set a torch with an economy that made Arthur want to shout praise when there was breath for it. The other's blade slid, sang, went for John's shoulder, and Arthur turned his wrist and brought Dawn up and through, and the ice sword parted with a sound like a winter lake cracking, and then the other itself went to hoarfrost under the blade. A rain of cold shards, and Arthur's teeth ached and his eyes watered, and he said, "Oh, because it is one thing to thin, and a different thing to learn." Another came and another, and Dawn answered them, and Arthur did not grow tired because the sword asked him not to, and he had always done what it asked. John was flame and breath beside him. A steadying presence, never in the way, not afraid in a way that disregarded fear so that it could sit down and let other things be done. After, when the gate stood and the dead lay in neat ash and messy blood, men looked at Arthur the way men look at a man who has become a story while they watched. He hated it and bore it and knew he could not set it down and walk to the river because rivers do not catch blades. The Lord Commander, no longer the old gravel-voiced one, for that man had died far from his chair in a place without enough sky, stood and crooked a finger. "You," he said. Arthur went, "because you go when men whose work is important ask." "My lord," he said. A ridiculous phrase for a man whose throne was a pressed plank and whose crown was rime. "Name," the commander said. He had the look of a man born to flint. "Arlen," Arthur said. "Arlen?" the commander repeated and looked at John, who had soot down his cheek and a cut in his lip that he did not seem to be aware of. "Your man there thinks you a god." "I think him a man," John said, and Arthur's throat tightened. "You hold that blade as if you were born with it," the commander said. "Keep holding it. I need you to go to Hardhome with me." "Now?" Arthur asked. "Before now," the commander said, and smiled despite himself. "But the world gives us now, so we will use it." They went with ships that creaked and officers who had never sailed here, men who looked at the sea beyond the wall and understood a new kind of fear. They found Hardhome full of the noise of starving and the smell of despair and the shape of an army trying to be people. They found a cliff and a storm and a choice between two bad paths, and chose the one that did not cut their feet and then cut them anyway. Arthur had never liked ships. He liked Hardhome less. He liked the way John moved among the wildlings without contempt, as if they had always been his, because that was how a boy who had grown up among orphans looks at men who have no banners and yet are men. He liked the way the old maester had given him a last bottle of fire to keep in his coat, and the way he had not broken it when it would have warmed him, because that was not what it was for. The others filled the cliff like a silence. They came with winter in their hands. Men shrieked not because they had not the courage to do otherwise, but because someone has to shriek when the world ends, or else the ending is too quiet to bear. Arthur saw John go for the children first. He saw him put a child into a boat, and his face change when he saw that there was no room for the mother, and then change again when he threw a pack overboard and made room because he could. He saw him look up when the first of the others walked onto the edge of the cliff above them, and saw the boy square his shoulders because his body knew how to present itself to battle even when the man inside would never be ready. They could not save everyone. They could not save half. They cut rope and pushed boats out and shouted men to speed and turned away when hands slipped in the water. And Arthur saw John bleed from a cut he could not remember receiving and did not have time to bind. He kept Dayne in his hand. The sword hummed along his bones. It did not sing. It went about the business of cutting. Another stepped down out of mist, slow as certainty. It watched Arthur. It lifted its blade, and Arthur felt a thing he had not felt since he was a boy on a terrace in Starfall, watching a storm roll in over the sea. It was awe. He wanted to see if he could match it. He did. He stepped in. He let the blade's momentum carry him when it needed to and turn him when it could. He trusted his feet and the sword and John's steady fire and the old rightness of tilt-turn-thrust. The other's blade jarred him less than before. Dayne did not cut clean through ice now. It slid and bit and shattered. The other made no sound. His head went in a scatter of frost. His body made no comfort of blood. Arthur drew breath. He drew another. His lungs burned in a way that was almost pleasant. He turned his head, and a blow he did not see hit him from behind, hard and low. Men do not cry out often. He did not. He went to his knees and turned, and the weight of the thing came again, and his ribs said something he could not translate over the sound of blood and sea. John was there. He was there as he had always been, as if Arthur had made a habit of looking and finding him and had never been disappointed. He had the black knife in his hand. He had dawn in his eyes. "Take it," Arthur said before he could think why he must. He shoved the sword hilt first toward the boy. The grip felt warm and sticky in his hand. His glove had split and there was blood. John balked. "No," he said, instinct or honor or fear. "Take it," Arthur said, and there was the sound of command in his voice that he had not used in years, the sound that makes boys straighten and men obey. "Take it and be the morning for these people." John took it. He did not falter under the weight. He did not marvel. His hand closed and he stepped into a rhythm he had been born to and trained for and had chosen. Dawn made a brighter arc now, as if a different sun had risen and needed a better blade to reflect itself. John's first stroke took an other through the chest, and the sound it made was a protest, and Arthur found, through the pain that was taking up more of his attention by the heartbeat, that he was smiling. "Look at that," he said to no one. It was not a long fight. Nothing in winter is, because cold eats hours as surely as fire. Boats shoved off. A few came back. One did not. Men died and a few did not. John killed and then turned and helped and then did not look over his shoulder at W. Hat he could not fix or looked and did not freeze when he learned he could not. That was a different kind of courage than the one that lifts a sword. They left Hardhome, which is a name and a lie, with a handful of more lives than they had come with. That is a triumph against winter. Arthur sat in the bottom of a boat and tried not to let his blood out on the boards. It had other ideas. John crouched beside him when there was no one else to lift or burn or steady, and his face, the river had put a mask of calm on it. He had a way of being quiet that steadied even the other quiet around him. "I told the commander to take my vote back," John said, as if men were counting beans at his back instead of bodies. "I told him I had other business than leading, that there is a higher one and we're staring at it." Arthur chuckled, a little sound. It hurt. "You are your father's son," he said, "and your mother's, and yours besides." "Who were they?" John asked. He did not grip Arthur's hand, because men in boats do not grip men in boats unless the boat is going over. He set his hand on Arthur's shoulder and laid his weight there until Arthur thought the weight might keep him from floating away into the dark. "Who were my father and mother?" Arthur had spent 16 years learning how to be silent. He had grown a forest around words and put stones at its foot and laid his body down in front of the path. He had waited and waited. He had caught a sword in his blood, and he was not a superstitious man, and he was. He said their names. He said, Rhaegar, and he said, Lyanna. And he watched them fall into John like two swords into a scabbard he had been carrying empty and did not know the shape of. John's eyes did something strange then, a widening without surprise. He had not known, and he had always known. That is the way with certain truths. They are only new to the ear. The prince? John breathed, and then he frowned, and Arthur saw then he would never be anyone's prince. The woman with the blue petals, he said instead, and smiled as if in pain at the image of someone he had never had in his hands. She wanted me to live. She did, Arthur said, and I wanted to keep my vow. And Ned Stark wanted to keep both vows, and he did for as long as the world allowed. And then you had to take them. John bowed his head. The sword lay against his leg. It made a pale line against black. I will not wear a crown, he said. If I did, the metal would crack in the cold. I will not be a king if the world sets the crown on my head. I will take a vow that keeps men standing, and I will stay standing until the day the cold puts me down. Good, Arthur said. Good boy. He coughed, and there was red on his lip. He felt no cold. That was not good. He glanced past John and saw the shore and the thin spires of the wall like ocean waves petrified, and he thought, I will not die in a bed because I have never learned how to lie down well. Listen, he said, because there was not much time. You do not need a sword to be a sword. It helps. You will have this one sometimes. Sometimes you will have another. Sometimes you will have none. You must not let that make you any less honest. John's brow furrowed. You always talk as if I understand, he said. It's flattering and irritating. You will, Arthur said. When you do, you will hate me for it for a little while. Then you will forgive me. Then you will forget to be angry, because there will be too much to do. He closed his eyes because the horizon tilted, and only by shutting out the light could he find level. He felt John's hand on his shoulder, steady. He thought of Ashera with a storm on her face, and of Lyanna with a flower in her fist, and of Rhaegar with a harp bending his back. And he thought of Ned Stark with his mouth set carrying a sword he had no right to, and telling the world he had one more bastard to keep safe. And he thought, men make poor gods. It is better when the world reminds us. He did not die there. The boat pitched, and a wave took the last word he had saved up and threw it overboard, and he swallowed water and breath in the wrong order, and then he was on the cold stone with men shouting all the wrong things, and a woman's hands in his ribs that knew what to do in the dark, and he said something rude at her, and she laughed and told him to save that sort of language for beds. He slept and woke and slept and woke, and one day he woke for good because John was bending over him with a face that had stopped being a boy's entirely while Arthur had been busy dying. You left the sword with me, John said. I did, Arthur replied. His voice was thin. He felt like winter sun. I returned it, John said. He made the word returned important. It is yours. You were with it before I had hands. It is yours when you need it, Arthur said. He took the boy's hand. It was not a boy's hand. It was not even a young man's. It was a man's hand with work and pain in it. The Sword of the Morning is a title for men with a specific set of ancestors and a very stubborn streak. You have some of those things. You do not need all. When the world is dark, John said, as if he were saying it to himself, men choose mornings or they choose to be the night. You may be asked to be both, Arthur said. He thought of the oath he had taken in a cool hall when he was a boy, and of the one he had taken on a hot day by a river, and of the one he had watched John take under a sky that held so much cold it hardly had room for stars. He thought, we are made of promises and they're breaking. You will be asked to be both late. You will have to decide what to be in what order. Will you be here? John asked. For as long as I can, Arthur said. He knew then, and he saw in John's eyes that John knew too, that his long was not as long as it might once have been. He had bled too much of it out on a boat. He had put pieces of himself into the hands of men along the river and along the wall and in a hard place with nothing green. He had enough left to stand in one more dawn, if the world asked him. It did. It always does. The message came from a place south of the wall that did not think it needed the wall and then found it did. The war had rolled. It had crushed things. It had cried over a few and moved on. The boy who had once been the king in the north was bones or ashes or both. Men in the Riverlands were building again badly. Stannis held a mountain with a grip like a vice and learned what it means to be a king when there is no one left to bow. The red woman said words that made no sense to Arthur and would have to someone else. She looked at him as if he were a candle that offended her for being a different shade of light. "It is not for you," she told him. "It is for the boy." "It was always for the boy," Arthur said. He did not want to leave again. He wanted to stand on the wall and teach men to press their hips into a cut. He wanted to stop the winter where it pushed. But the world is not one thing at a time. It asked him to go with John to speak to men who would not understand without seeing. And so he went. And he stood in halls that had once held men who thought themselves kings, and he put dawn on tables and watched men look. He told no one the names he had said to John. He told this lord and that prince and this woman with oranges on her tongue how ice falls and how to set men like stones into an arch to bear weight. He made himself useful, which is the only way men live through years that hate them. In a marsh with reeds that sang, Howland Reed came to him again, old as peat now and twice as necessary. He put a hand to Arthur's shoulder where a rib clicked just wrong and said, "You are not a reed. You keep trying to be." "I am a sword," Arthur said. "You are a man holding a sword," Howland corrected gently. "You are a friend to boys who would otherwise become men too violently. You are a promise to a dead man and a living woman and a prince who thought music was an answer. You are a winter and a morning. You are as heavy as your blade and lighter in your feet than an old man has any right to be. You are not a reed." Arthur laughed because it was kind to be told what you were not when the world insisted on telling you only what you were. He stayed that night in a place that smelled like old rain and listened to John speak to Howland about walls and men, about wildlings and vows, about whether the world could be new. He thought, this is what men should do when they are not cutting at things. They should make shapes with their mouths that hold. He came north again. He came to the wall with shoulders that set carefully into their sockets and a hand that sometimes lost a line of feeling. He had enough, still, to make a map of the yard and leave it on the bodies of boys until those bodies learned. The last morning he would stand. The air was clear to cruelty. It let you see too far. The sound of the horn came high and bright and wrong. It came with a sound like a mountain losing its balance very slowly. It came like a promise with a crack in it. They stood. They stood because that is what you do. John stood with the sword and with a voice that now bent the ears of men and wildlings with the same ease, and with a tired kindness that made Arthur want to lay down and let someone else have the day. They held. Men died. Men lived. Snow turned red and then pink and then white again where men's boots walked the story back into the ground. Arthur felt his body ask him for coin he had already spent, and he gave it anyway, and the debt mounted. He found himself with dawn in his right hand and a torch in his left, and he laughed, because he had once told John that you do not use both hands in a fight unless you are very, very tired or very, very good, and he saw in John's grin that the boy remembered. An other taller than a lord stepped into the gate's mouth. It moved like a prayer and like a smith's hammer and like a storm being polite. It filled the space with cold that made the air thick to breathe. Arthur moved because men who think move and die, and men who move sometimes live to think again. He set dawn against the blow, and a shock ran down his arm that made his heart skip. He turned his hips. He slid. He heard John say a word that might have been his name and might have been the name of any man whose presence makes other men braver. The other slid past him. Arthur slid past it. His foot hit blood that had not frozen yet, and he went down on one knee, and he knew, as surely as he had known the taste of ash the day Lyanna had looked at him, that this was the last time he would rise. He did not feel sorry. He did not regret the weight of the sword he had carried when the world had wanted him to carry a crown. He did not regret the river or the way oranges taste when you have burned your mouth on your own blood. He regretted only that he would not see what shape John made out of the pieces men handed him. John stepped into the space he left. He did exactly what he had been taught and exactly what he had invented for himself. He brought dawn down on the other's blade and lifted the torch, and the other fell back with a grace like a curtain closing. It did not look at Arthur. It did not need to. Arthur bled. He did it with a dignity that would have made Ashera roll her eyes and kiss his mouth. He did it with a patience that would have made Lyanna smack his shoulder and tell him not to be a martyr. He did it as Rhaegar would have, with a tune in his head that only he could hear. He did it as himself. He felt a hand against his cheek, and he thought it would be John's, but it was Mother Nara's, or someone with her hands, because the world is kind sometimes and sends you the right ghost. Do not be a fool, he told John when the boy's face bent into his vision at last. Do not be a hero unless you have to. Be a wall. Be a morning. Be a man who chooses and chooses and chooses again. I will, John said. Arthur put his palm against the boy's cheek. Good, he said. He listened because he had learned to listen at last to the sound of a sword in the world, and he heard it then like a dawn breaking in winter, thin and sure. He let his breath out. The sky was very clear. He set down the burden he had carried out of a tower of broken stones, and he did not look back because he had already taught himself how not to. John stood when the body stopped being the man he had loved. He stood because the living always do. He lifted the sword and he lifted his voice, and he did not break either. He turned to the men behind him, brothers and once enemies, boys and fathers, kings without crowns and men without names. And he said, in a voice that had learned command the hard way and would not use it without cost, hold. They held. It is what men do when someone worthy tells them to. The wall threw back the night again by inches. Mornings are made that way, by inches. When it was done there was more snow and less blood, and a sword that gleamed pale in light that does not warm, and men who were wounded or dead or shaking and had not fallen. There was a body laid under a cloak. There was a boy with the eyes of a prince and the mouth of a woman who had laughed in a tower and the hands of a riverman and a knight and whatever else time would make of him. He did not put a crown on his head. He put a sword in its scabbard and a vow in his mouth and a wall at his back. When the day came when he had to go south because the world was greedy and wanted him to hold two places at once, he went. When he had to come back north because the world had lied and said it could take care of itself, he came. He carried the morning with him as far as it would go, and when it faltered, he gave it to someone else for a while and took it back later when he had two hands again. He told the truth when he could, and when he could not, he held his tongue. He did not forget to be kind even when he had to be hard. The river did not forget him. It does not forget anyone who has learned its words. Sometimes, on a clear morning when the smoke from the wall's cookfires rose thin and white and the frost bit and let go in the same breath, he would look to the south and think he could taste oranges. Sometimes he would walk alone to a bend where wind collected, and when he stood there with his cloak wrapped and his hands bare, the cold would not touch him as keenly as it once had. The sword of the morning lay in its scabbard. It did not shine there. It did not speak. It did not need to. The man who carried it had in his hands the shape of men holding back a night. He had in his chest a tower where blue petals fell forever and a river that would take him if he slipped and put him down where someone could pick him up again. He had in his mouth the names of a prince and a girl who had made him possible, and he said them rarely and carefully, and when he did the ice did not crack, because the words fit where they went. When men came to him and asked him who had raised him, he looked at their faces and measured whether the truth would fit, and sometimes he told them a story about a boat and a woman with a scar on her lip and a man with clever hands who taught him how to hold a stick. Sometimes he told them about a knight who had laid down his sword and picked up a child and had not set either down after. Sometimes he said only, "A good man," and that was enough, because sometimes the names must be kept in the heart like a coal. When the last winter broke, because all winters do, he stood on the wall with men and women and children who had come to watch a thing they would tell their children about, and he watched the sun climb up the sky as if it were learning to walk again. He put his hand on the hilt of a pale sword that was older than names and newer than any morning, and he said, softly and only to himself, "This will do." In Starfall, a woman with Ashara's eyes walked under a white tower and put her hand to a stone that had always been cool and now felt warm. In Sunspear, a prince with gray in his hair and laughter still in his mouth squeezed the fingers of the woman he loved. In a marsh, a man as old as the bogs set his spear against his hut and smiled to see the fog lift. On the Greenblood, Mother Nara told a child a story about a prince of fish and a man who forgot he was a sword and then remembered in time. The world made another morning. The world will keep making them until it does not. In the meantime, there are men to teach where to hold the blade and how to keep a foot on ice without falling, and there are boys to herd into fireside tales, and there are women whose hands make sense of blood, and there is always a river somewhere, and someone carrying a weight they did not ask for as if it were the only thing that ever fit their shoulders.